In the field of the triple nexus, we distinguish between peace with a capital P and peace with a small p. So we see peace building at the micro level that has to do with improving intra-community relations, etc. We carried out a piece of work a few years ago about the triple nexus in Venezuela and in Latin America in general, and we actually explored this issue in quite a lot of depth. The whole idea of stigmatization, etc. So even though the problems that Karlos mentions exist, I do believe that the triple nexus approach offers an opportunity that wasn't there before to open up everything we do to incorporating more different elements linked to peace building. So perhaps I'm slightly more optimistic than my colleague, because I do believe that it often offers an opportunity to incorporate peace workers. Could I also react as well? In fact, in the chat, I've posted a link to a document, because it is true that peace is a key element of the triple nexus approach. And when we were working in the Interagency Standing Committee with different UN agencies and different NGOs as well, when we were working in that committee, one of the things we worked on was the lack of clarity. Again, when we talk about peace, what are we talking about? This is exactly what Paco said. And in fact, you can find more information about that in the document that I've posted in the chat. It's a document that what it aims to do is to explain what it is we're talking about when we talk about peace, in all its different aspects, in all its different facets, and how working with peace builders in certain contexts can in fact generate a problem for organizations that have a humanitarian mandate, because sometimes there's a bit of a clash. So when we carried out this research and feedback of our different concepts, we generated a series of podcasts with different colleagues in different countries who are working with the triple nexus. And one of the issues that we focused on was peace and humanitarian principles. And there are, of course, tensions. There is tension, and that's true because in what we understand by peace, we also have security interventions. And in some contexts, when we're talking about stabilization operations, there are elements that can generate difficulties when you're trying to carry out a joint piece of work. So it's important that we really unpack a little bit what peace actually means. I know some people are working on that. There was something that we published in working group number 4 about the tools that can be used by different humanitarian organizations to work on certain elements of peace and how we can work on the whole issue of principles. It's all published. It's a complex issue. It's very complex to actually use humanitarian principles in our day-to-day activities, because it's not a yes or no recipe. It's not a black or white issue. It's not black and white. Sometimes it's just a case of striking a balance between some principles and others. And this is another element that I think, because the non-sequentiality is important, and we'll see that a little bit later on when we look at the different contexts. But peace is important in triple nexus, and work has been done to try to identify what we mean when we talk about peace. But what we do need still is a space in which the different stakeholders can sit down and work together to come up with a definition about what the triple nexus actually is. At the moment, we just have very scattered, silo-based work with the 3 pillars working separately. But if we carry on with that, we're not going to be able to move forward at all. Thank you very much.
Sí, gracias, Marta, Paco.
Thank Carlos, you both, Marta, Paco, and thank you, Karlos. We have a second question. Does it make sense currently to talk about the triple nexus in decentralized international cooperation? One of the main dangers is what happens with humanitarian principles in context of conflict, in violent contexts. Currently, most of the contexts we're dealing with in long-term conflicts. So, does it make sense, actually, to talk about the triple nexus in these contexts, peace building context? Do we still need to keep going deep into this joint work we're carrying out? What do you think about it? Well, from my point of view, the triple nexus is an approach, and this is aligned with what Karlos just said when there was this discussion about support to development. This has to do with the changes in conflictivity around the world, and this situation has changed, and the triple nexus is trying to adapt itself more to the recent changes. And in that sense, I believe this is a very timely approach, especially in fragile scenarios concerning after-war reconstruction context and in processes where peace building is key. And that's this discussion about whether the triple nexus is an approach that can be escalated. Well, I think we need to look at the triple nexus approach, and this is complementary to what Marta and Karlos just said, not as one of our problems, people dealing with humanitarian aid. I mean, it has to do with all three pillars, humanitarian action, development, and peace building. The people working in these three pillars need to take it into consideration. The development stakeholders need to tackle themes and issues related to conflict, and also humanitarian stakeholders need to take it into consideration. But we shouldn't look at triple nexus as a problem of the people working in humanitarian action. I think that all stakeholders need to take it into consideration. This is an idea we need to discuss. I think that if triple nexus has one benefit is that it helps us to get rid of the silos, and it helps us to work together from the very beginning. Of course, we have to face issues concerning humanitarian actions or peace building as well.
¿Quién sigue? Marta, voy yo.
Dale, Karlos.
Bueno, vale.
Karlos?
Bueno, pues sí, concuerdo con lo que estaba planteando
Paco. With Paco.
No solo es pertinente el triple nexo, sino que
the triple nexus is not just timely, it is necessary. Obviously, we have to modulate it. We have to mitigate the possible risks it could lead to in terms of instrumentalization of humanitarian aid, etc. But I think that one working approach, combining or looking for synergies between all three silos, as Marta said, all three pillars, I think that would be key. We live in a context where each one of the three pillars, each one of the three silos, humanitarian action, development, and peace building, by itself is now more necessary than ever. Because there is more and more conflict, we have less and less solidarity, we have more and more humanitarian crisis, and therefore we need more of each one of these three pillars. We've also observed an increasing weight of armed conflicts as a cause of humanitarian crisis and human displacement as a cause of famine. Over the past years, there have been report issues that have observed and concluded that armed conflicts are the main cause of famine in the world. So it would be impossible to think in terms of sustainable development and in terms of how to face or cover for human needs to reduce humanitarian crisis if we don't move forward in preventing conflicts and if we don't move forward in peace building. So conflict and peace building are two elements that are part of all everything we do: humanitarian action, cooperation for development, and peace building. I would also say that the triple nexus is timely and necessary to increase the coherence of the different support policies in the three pillars: humanitarian action, cooperation for development, and peace building. There's a clear idea that working in separate and isolated silos is not enough. It's not efficient. The outcomes are not adequate. So we need to combine all three pillars. We need to find synergies there, so that different organizations like the UN, for instance, since 2015, it's started a process to increase the coherence of its main pillars: cooperation for development, peace building, and security. They put all of them in a package, and also human rights. The aim would be to strengthen all these levels, and for that they have this process to reform their peace building and security pillar with a more preventive perspective, so that they can work in coordination with cooperation for development and human rights. And the same thing goes for the EU. They have an integral approach now that tries to combine things to provide internal coherence to all of their policies. So looking for more consistency in the different policies, I think that a triple nexus could be a very good tool, a fundamental tool, actually.
Bueno, yo solo añadir
I
un
just
par de
wanted to
puntos
add a couple
esto
of
que
points
acaban
here.
de mencionar Paco y Karlos, que es que además de que cada vez hay más conflictos, cada vez
We
los
have more
conflictos
conflicts, and these conflicts
se duran más, ¿no? En los años
last
80,
longer. Back
aparentemente
in
la
the
media de
80s,
un
apparently the
conflicto
average
eran 13 años.
duration
En
of a
los
conflict
años
was 13 years.
2010,
Then in 2010,
estábamos ya en 20
2018,
años.
the average was
Entonces,
already
con la
20 years.
ampliación
So
del tiempo que duran los conflictos,
conflicts
las
tend to
necesidades se
last longer,
profundizan.
and therefore we
Y
have
aparte que
deeper
tenemos que
needs.
tener en cuenta también
On
que
top
hay
of
una
that, we also
serie de
need to take
países
into
que
consideration there's
debido
a whole
a
series of
situaciones
countries that, due
políticas,
to their
no
political
reciben
situations, do not
ningún tipo de inversión de desarrollo
have
y
any
muy
investment
poco
for
de
development and
inversión de
very
construcción de la
little
paz.
investment for peace
Entonces, creo que es
building.
importante que
And
tengamos en
therefore,
cuenta
it is
que el
important for
trabajo
us to take
humanitario
this into
no va a
consideration.
acabar de manera
Humanitarian work will
sostenible
not
con un
end
problema
in
de
a
necesidades.
sustainable
Las
way
necesidades humanitarias es
with
el
all
resultado
the
de
needs. The
problemas de
humanitarian
desarrollo
needs are the
y
result of
de
problems of
conflictos que tienen que ver
development, of
con tensiones
conflicts
internas
that have
o
to do with
regionales o
internal
mundiales.
tension,
No es
or regional
posible
tension,
pensar
or
que una
international
respuesta
tension.
humanitaria va a acabar
So
con las
humanitarian
necesidades.
response
Y
will
creo que hay
not
un aspecto que tiene que ver con la
cover all these
responsabilidad
needs.
de
And there's
intentar
something that
buscar
has to do with the
soluciones, pero
responsibility.
soluciones
We need to find
sostenibles.
solutions,
Entonces,
sustainable
por eso
solutions.
creo
That's
que es
our
muy relevante que
responsibility.
trabajemos en la
And this is
implementación del
why I
nexo,
believe we need to
porque el nexo lo que
work
pretende
on the
es
development of the
construir
triple
este
nexus,
marco
which
de
is aimed at
responsabilidades
building
conjuntas
this
para intentar
joint
acabar con las
responsibility
necesidades.
framework to
En el
try
año
and cover all the needs.
2020, desde el grupo
In
global
2020,
de Nexo hicimos un mapeo de buenas prácticas.
we
Lo
carried out
volvimos a
a
repetir el año
best
pasado, en el
practice study that
2023,
was
y ahora se va
repeated
a
over
publicar en el
again back
2024.
in
Y una de las
2023, and it will be carried out again in 2024.
de lo que
And
pudimos
one
ver
of our
es que
conclusions
realmente la
is
implementación
that actually
programática del
the
nexo
programmatic
está muy lejos
implementation of
aún.
the triple
Es decir,
nexus
si
is still very
hablamos y hablamos
far
del
from
nexo y se habla de
being
las
true.
buenas
So we talk about the
prácticas
triple
en
nexus,
relación
about
al
best
compartir
practices,
reflexiones y
about sharing
compartir
reflections
análisis,
and
pero la
analysis,
implementación
but then
pragmática de
the
estrategias
pragmatic
que
implementation of
trabajen
strategies
sobre el
working
nexo es algo que todavía no se
on
ha
the triple
conseguido.
nexus is
Y
something we
es una pena
haven't
porque hemos
achieved
hablado
yet.
mucho
And
del
it's a
nexo y es
shame
verdad que
because
los
we've
humanitarios lo
spoken
enfocamos
a
todo
lot about
desde
the
una
triple
óptica
nexus,
donde
and
el
we
tiempo
tend
es
to
el
look at
elemento
things where
crucial y
time
pensamos
is
que vamos a
crucial.
transformar la manera en la que
And we believe
trabajamos
we're going to
en
transform the
cuestión de
way we
6
work in
meses,
a matter of
cosa que es
6
poco
months,
realista.
in 6
Pero creo
months'
que,
time,
o
and
sea,
that's not
el
realistic,
mundo lo que nos
actually.
está diciendo
So
no
what
es que sea
is the
relevante,
world
es que es
telling
relevante y es
us?
urgente
Well, this
trabajar
is
sobre el
relevant, and
nexo
it is also
porque cada vez hay más
urgent to develop
necesidades
this
y
concept
cada
of
vez hay
triple
menos
nexus, because we have
recursos
more and more
y
needs, we have less and less resources,
complementariedad de mucha
and the
necesidad y poco
complementarity
recurso,
of
pues lo
needs
único que puede
and
acabar es
little
con más
resources
necesidades.
will lead to
Entonces,
more
creo que es
needs.
importante que
So I
tengamos en
believe
cuenta
it's
todos
key
estos
that we
elementos
have
y
all
os
these
invito a
elements
leer
into
ese análisis de
consideration.
buenas
I encourage
prácticas,
you to read
ese que
this best
levanta
practice
algunos
analysis that we
casos
carried out.
interesantes en
In some
16
cases. You will see very interesting cases about 16 different countries and different regions in these countries where the triple nexus has been analyzed. I think it's important in contexts of conflict, but also in contexts where there are complex crises with political elements and ingredients. For a few years now, we also talk about triple nexus related to climate change. So the triple nexus is a very broad concept that includes many things, but I think we need to highlight this topic about complementarity and strategic collaboration.
Muchísimas gracias. Os voy a lanzar una última pregunta porque vamos como un poco justos de tiempo.
Thank you very much. We're not doing very well for time. So I'm going to ask you one last question. There will be time for questions later on after the presentation of the study. You were saying that this triple nexus approach stems from multilateral organization and has a top-down approach.
You know
a lot about decentralized cooperation in the Basque country and in Spain. I would like to ask you, to what extent can we foster this approach in small corporations, in small projects with limited budgets, with many organizations involved, many of them having multiple mandate? That's my question to you. Do you think it's feasible to foster a triple nexus in this decentralized cooperation?
Esta se la dejamos a Karlos, que es de Bilbao.
Bueno, tú, Paco, conoces bastante bien el
trabajo Karlos answer. He's from Bilbao. Well, Francisco, you're an expert in decentralized cooperation. You could also answer the question. But Paco, I believe you used to write Paco with a K, which was the Basque way of writing your name. So I think you could answer the question. Anyhow, I would say that it actually makes sense to talk about the triple nexus in decentralized cooperation. Of course, it has its features and peculiarities, but it also has some very important potential, which is something we're going to see later on in the presentation of the report. I would mention something that Paco said earlier on, this difference between peace with a capital P and with a small p. Peace with a capital P would include a whole series of activities. When we talk about the triple nexus, and each one of us conceptualizes it from its field, whenever we talk about multilateral organizations, the UN, the EU, very often we talk in terms of peace with a capital P. The diplomatic work and support of diplomatic support in peace processes, or even activities concerning security and stabilization, crisis management, anti-terrorism activities, etc. This is included in this triple nexus package as our way of understanding peace, but there is a different way of understanding peace with a little p, which is critical peace or post-liberal peace. The support of local initiatives for peace building or reconciliation, activities that can be carried out anytime, not just after an armed conflict, as we see in the literature of the UN when they define peace building in these terms, but rather activities that can be carried out anytime, before, during, and after an armed conflict at a local level, which can help to generate reconciliation, lower the tension, and tackle the structural roots of the conflict, etc., etc. So I think that the main risk of instrumentalization of humanitarian aid that can stem from triple nexus, meaning from relating humanitarian action and linking it to activities for peace building. These risks occur mainly whenever we think about peace with a capital P, meaning when we have geopolitical interests and geopolitical agendas having an influence here. on the states.
And
in that sense, the decentralized cooperation works at a different level. It is not so much affected by the geopolitical agenda. Of course, there are other interests at stake there, but these large interests of the states are not that present in a decentralized cooperation. There are interests in terms of security or geopolitics that are not there. And I also think that because of this and because of its dimensions, decentralized cooperation can focus more on peace with a little p, on supporting local community-based initiatives where we can make the most of the potential of, for instance, Basque cooperation in terms of human rights or gender-based justice or transitional justice, for instance. I think that in these fields, Basque cooperation is working very well, and it could be interesting to incorporate all these dimensions to concerning cooperation for development and humanitarian action. I think that decentralized cooperation can have more potential to innovate, to look for more innovative approaches, more transformative approaches of triple nexus when we work at a local level. I would concentrate, I would focus our field of action to the local level. I don't think that an NGO can have largest or should have a larger scope. I think that's fundamental because that's where we're going to be having scenarios for peace building.
Gracias, Carlos. ¿Algún aporte, Paco? Marta?
Thank you very much, Carlos. Paco? I would like to add something here.
Para la descentralizada, el triple nexus es una oportunidad.
Decentralized cooperation, the triple nexus is an opportunity to incorporate other stakeholders that are more related to peace building, for instance. And as we've said, they haven't so far participated in tasks concerning cooperation. And I think this is a good opportunity, an opportunity to renew this decentralized cooperation. Generally speaking, I'm not just talking about Basque cooperation. Decentralized cooperation is a concept that was created some decades ago, very much related to some demonstrations. And I think this is a concept that needs to be adapted little by little. And this incorporation of peace building and looking at the root causes of violent conflicts in a different way, this leads to new opportunities and it gives more consistency to decentralized cooperation. I share the reflections you've shared with us today. I think that small is beautiful, and this small-scale cooperation is also beautiful. I think that's the added value of the decentralized cooperation. That's something we need to highlight in this triple nexus approach. Thank you. Thank you very much, Marta. Is there anything you would like to add? Well, I totally agree with Carlos and Paco. I would just like to add that there's something really relevant here, which is the capacity of decentralized cooperation to foster other visions and to guarantee that the organizations we work with have this broad view of things, and so that this change is fostered. Working at this small scale, I think that this is helpful because the large scale has some issues that will require longer to solve and to sort out. And I think the decentralized cooperation has something to contribute with. I think it can be very transformative, actually. Thank you. Very well, thank you very much. Thank you for answering these three questions. I think that we've tackled very interesting topics. We're now going to be taking some questions from the audience. We're going to use our chat for that. So go ahead. If you want to write your questions in the chat, go ahead. If you want to take the floor and ask your questions orally, please do so. But I would ask you to introduce yourselves and tell us where you come from and what your name is. Thank you.
No sé, Alicia, si en el chat hay
Alicia,
alguna
are there any
pregunta.
questions on the chat?
Por ahora no hemos recibido ninguna pregunta
Not so
ni
far.
comentario. Ha habido una petición de que
There aren't any
se
questions or comments in the
se
chat.
traduzca al francés
There's
uno de
been
los
a
documentos
request
compartidos por Marta,
for us to translate
pero ninguna
into French
pregunta.
one of the documents that Marta just shared,
Bueno,
but
pues
there aren't any
si
questions
no hay
here.
preguntas,
Okay,
avanzamos.
if there aren't
Igual,
any
mira,
questions,
por ahí
we can
Fernando
move
Almanza
forward.
levanta la mano.
Fernando Almanza,
Adelante, Fernando, preséntate.
go ahead. Please introduce yourself. Can you hear me? My name is Fernando. Can you hear me all right?
Sí.
I don't know if my mic's on. Yeah, you can hear me. Fernando Almanza, freelance consultant. I would like to thank you for inviting me to this meeting. Thank the speakers who are dear friends to me. I have a question about one of the last concepts you tackled, which I think is important. Paco, you said that small is beautiful, and I agree. But I think we shouldn't call it small. I think that the greatest thing that we do in humanitarian action is that we work with people one by one with different ages. That's our dimension, and we are huge. So everything we can do at that local community-based scale concerning social peace, forgiveness even, which is very complex, is huge. It's huge for us in humanitarian action. So I would like to defend that idea that we're not that small. We're actually quite big. And as you've said, especially you, Karlos, that macro piece that is structural is still far from being true. There's still a lot of suffering on the planet. And I think that the best thing about the triple nexus is that it can help us to achieve peace. And when you speak to the communities, they don't say that they live in silos. The reality combines everything. So we need to be very careful when we use these terms. So the people are the stakeholders of their own reality, and we are just there to help them in this process. So the biggest thing of all is sometimes what we call small. Thank you.
Listo. Eskerrik asko, Fernando.
Thank you,
Bueno, pues
Fernando.
Quizás,
Thank you
perdona,
very
Pilar,
much.
hay una pregunta
Sorry, Pilar. There's a
hay una
question
pregunta
here.
de Yvonne Christine
There's a
que le
question by
gustaría
Yvonne
saber cuáles son
Christine.
las
She would like to know
funciones de las personas que nos han
what
hecho
are
la
the
presentación,
functions
un poco el
or
perfil
the roles of the people that have
que
been
han
talking to us,
presentado. No
the
sé si puedes
speakers.
resumir así muy
Can you
brevemente
maybe summarize
para
very
Yvonne.
briefly for Yvonne who they are or what the background is? Yes, we've had
Karlos Pérez de Armiño, que es
Karlos
profesor
Pérez de Armiño, who is a teacher of international relations at the University of the Basque Country, and he is also a researcher at Hegoa, Institute for Development, and he's written many papers about humanitarian action. Francisco Rey is a founder of IETA, the Institute of Studies on Conflict and Humanitarian Action. He's also a consultant and a researcher on this topic, and on the IASC website you can get information about him. There are many papers of this. And Marta Valdés is Humanitarian Director of Oxfam International. Over the past 5 years, she's been co-leading the fourth group of the IASC CS Reference Group on Humanitarian Development and Collaboration. Thank you.
Ahora con la presentación de la investigación.
Let's now move on to the presentation of the research. Well, we're going to be presenting the conclusions to you, the conclusions and recommendations of a study carried out by the Institute for Studies on Conflicts and Humanitarian Action, called Focus on Triple Nexus Humanitarian Action, Development, Peace Building and Interventions, funded by eLankidetza, by Alfredo Langa Professor and Lucía Mateos. We're going to hand the floor to Alfredo, who has a PhD in economics and a master's degree in international cooperation. He's a lecturer at the Alice Salomon University in Berlin, and a researcher of IASC. He also teaches at several universities in Europe and Latin America, and is an honorary collaborator of the Pablo de Olavide University in Seville. He's been teaching and working for more than 20 years in the fields of conflict management, development, etc. Lucía has a degree in social work and a master's degree in international development cooperation. She has experience in the third sector and as a social worker, and she's been a member of the IASC team for the last year. She started as a training technician and is currently a research technician, so she's collaborated in this study. So whenever you're ready, Alfredo, Lucía, you can share with us the outcomes of this research work. Thank you very much to all of you. Thank you for this opportunity. I am currently in Berlin, although I don't have a German accent. I would like to thank eLankidetza for this opportunity, and I would also like to thank them for their collaboration in this report. We've had some focus groups and interviews with experts in collaboration, also with colleagues at the IECAH. And without their support, making this report would have been very difficult. Karlos, Marta, and Paco are wonderful speakers, and I feel honored to be here with them. This is a huge responsibility for me. Let me just tell you that the main goal of this study is to be useful. You see here up on the stage some QR codes you can scan with your phones to access the study. On the left-hand side, you see the summary of the study. On the right-hand side, you see the whole study. I don't have much time here, so I'm just going to be focusing on the conclusions and recommendations of this study.
So the idea was to move away from what could be just another fad. So it's important to understand that this report was aimed to actually make a positive contribution to the debate. That was our aim. We've heard that there's a lot of doubt about the application of the triple nexus approach. So we wanted to contribute to this open debate, and it's also a document that is open to criticism itself and to contributions. Because from a methodological perspective, the perspective of tools and instruments, a lot of work has still yet to be done. So we're talking, often people talk about in conflict or on conflict. So not just working on conflict, not just working in a situation of conflict, you're working on the conflict as well. And then we have problems with the definition of the word peace. A lack of peace identifies violence, direct violence, structural violence, etc. And then the idea that conflict itself isn't always something negative. What you need to do is work to transform the conflict. It's not just a case of construction or stabilization. We need to go beyond that. We do apologize, but Alfredo's sound is not very good. It breaks up sometimes. We're doing our very best to interpret what he's saying.
importante trabajar de manera,
so it's important
un poco hoy en día, de manera sofisticada,
to work in a more sophisticated way, a more holistic way, a more simultaneous way as well. This is what the idea of the triple helix is all about. Not working on these three things in parallel, but working on them all together. The triple nexus is not just focused on humanitarian action. It's a focus on all three components at the same time. And what we've tried to do is to be useful, to provide something useful to eLankidetza and also the other partner organizations, and in fact all organizations working in Spain. So let's just have a look at the aims of the study and then the methodology that we've used. So I'll pass over to my colleague and then I'll come back to talk very briefly about the conclusions and recommendations. So I'm going to pass the floor now to Lucía. Thank you all very much. Thank you for being here today, giving us the opportunity to present the results of this study. I'm going to focus on the aims of the study. The main aim was to analyze the opportunities, challenges, and limitations for incorporating the triple nexus approach into the interventions funded by eLankidetza. We also have established 4 secondary aims. First of all, to analyze the degree to which the triple nexus approach is already incorporated into the interventions financed by eLankidetza from 2018 to 2023. Secondly, to analyze and to assess the criteria applied by eLankidetza to incorporate the triple nexus approach, identify difficulties and opportunities. Third, to provide specific and actionable recommendations about how to improve the integration of the triple nexus approach in future interventions funded by eLankidetza. And then also the aim is to foster learning and collaboration in the implementation of the approach by organizing this workshop, where we'll be sharing our knowledge and thoughts with different Basque humanitarian organizations and local partners, presenting the results of the study and discussing different practical experiences. What was the methodology used? Well, we used both a qualitative and a quantitative methodology, so a mixed methodology. We also, first of all, we carried out a documentary review, a review of the literature, and we were guided in that task by a series of questions which take into account criteria of coordination, consistency or coherence and complementarity. And this is provided by the OECD. So we've analyzed the different laws in the Basque Country and also strategies. We also analyzed the call for humanitarian aid and then a set of 57 different files or reports on interventions funded by eLankidetza between 2018 and 2023. So we compared what had been carried out during this time. And just to help you understand the table a little bit better, let me explain the instruments. Pro K1 and Pro K3 measure different projects. PRE are humanitarian aims, and EHE are projects that last longer and have a larger budget. And the Z are direct projects. So we didn't have a random sample, we wanted a representative sample. The initial aim was to analyze just humanitarian projects, but afterwards we believed it would be interesting to have a smaller sample with direct help in order to get a more representative sample. We carried out interviews with key stakeholders, representatives of different organizations and staff, technical staff at eLankidetza. 7 interviews were held in total We had people from UNICEF and other organizations as well. And thanks to these interviews, we were able to obtain first-hand information about different experiences in the initiatives and the use of tools. And also it gave us an idea about where we should be heading in the future. And also, during the process, during the study, we maintained an open dialogue with eLankidetza. They provided us with information and contextual information to enable us to understand better all the different documents that have been analyzed. So here we have the structure of the study. This is the index so that you can get an idea of the structure. First of all, we have the introduction and then the aims. In this fourth section, we talk about the context, the origin of the triple nexus approach, and then we carry out an analysis of the strategic framework of eLankidetza. So we have the strategic framework, we have analysis of the different calls, we have the analysis of the different aid that was granted. And then we analyze the principal findings of the study, which are divided into 4 different areas, same as for the analysis, but we divide it with regard to direct aid and humanitarian aid. And then in logical sequence, we offer a series of 8 recommendations. We don't distinguish between the different categories because it's a recommendation for Lankidetza as a whole, not for the different projects. And then finally, we've included appendix number 1, which specifies the criteria that we use to analyze the different projects. And also for the calls and the interventions, we also used a series of questions, asked a series of questions in order to detect different aspects. And Appendix 2 are examples of questions to be included in the project formulas, the project forms, with the aim of improving everything that we do. And now we'll move on to the conclusions of the study. So I'm going to pass the floor back to my colleague, Alfredo. Thank you very much, Lucía. So these conclusions and the recommendations stem in this very practical outlook and the desire to be useful for eLankidetza and for other organizations as well. We have 16 conclusions. I'm just going to go through them one by one, and then we'll have a look at the different recommendations that we propose for each conclusion. So if you have access to the document, you can look at the summary and the abstract. But as Lucía said, these conclusions are the results of a series of findings. So there's a very clear logical sequence that we followed in them. So it's nothing too original, it's just a very logical sequence. So we found a series of findings, principal ideas, basically, and then we condense them into conclusions, and then we use them as the basis for the recommendations. So we have 4 different areas. One, we have the strategic framework. That would be the first one. And we've first focused on the Cooperation Act in Spain and the strategy for cooperation as well. So we have the master plan, which stems from that act, that law. And the first conclusion is that the legal and strategic framework for international cooperation that has been developed by eLankidetza incorporates elements of the triple nexus approach implicitly. So it implicitly incorporates these elements, both with regard to the Act and the master plan. The aim now would be to incorporate them explicitly, not just implicitly. The next conclusion has to do with the Humanitarian Action Strategy 2018 to 2026, which is an important document. And we believe that it is a document which is more closely linked with the triple nexus approach, because it talks about strengthening ties between the different areas, talks about raising awareness among Basque citizens. And so as a result of that, we believe that it's an important document, and I think we need to foster a further recognition of the triple helix approach in this strategy. So it needs to be reinforced in an explicit way. Perhaps we should just develop a specific section, or maybe a cross-cutting section, which would touch on all the different things that we will be carrying out. With regard to calls for funding and measurement instruments, here we see that the assessment criteria for the calls for projects, development projects, and education for social transformation products, which will be K1 and K3, humanitarian action, which is EHE and PRE. In those criteria, the triple helix approach is mentioned implicitly, but perhaps the aim would be to have a direct mention of it. We believe that each element of the nexus should be presented as having the same weight. We don't want to visualize the triple nexus approach as a humanitarian action approach. Rather, it needs to be a threefold approach, with each three parts having the same weight. And then to continue in the same category, we have concluded that calls for grants demand the application of the logical framework, which we believe is an opportunity to incorporate tools that are sensitive to conflict, such as action without harm. So we believe that this is a good opportunity to gain more information and to increase the knowledge that we have within the organization. So we believe that this, in fact, can be useful, and we can combine different frameworks for action in what we do. And in fact, that's reflected in the recommendation. It's also important to highlight here that action without harm is not the only way of practically incorporating the triple nexus approach. And in fact, in all the calls for grants, we need to have a cross-cutting approach to facilitate the application of the triple nexus. And we believe we do have a mechanism for doing that. So with regard to the logical framework, it's important for action without harm, in fact, should be able to modify the matrix that we use, for example, outcomes, how we measure outcomes, because otherwise it makes no sense to talk about sensitivity to conflict if that is not clearly incorporated in the identification and the design of projects. And then another conclusion as I said before, is that in all the calls for projects, we need to facilitate the application of the nexus in a cross-cutting way, alongside other cross-cutting approaches such as the gender perspective, for example, strengthening local capacities, the generation of engagement and participation processes. This is, again, another very important issue. The rights-based approach, there are difficulties there because identification and articulation of what is understood as a right is sometimes slightly problematic. And we have to decide who the rights holders are and the obligations towards those rights holders. As Marta mentioned, there's a new element perhaps in being incorporated into the triple nexus. Maybe it should be the quadruple nexus, because we're including climate change into the nexus as well. So there's a lot of opportunities here, which is why we believe it would be important to incorporate all of these elements and to work on them. Next conclusion is that the flexibility, or the very low level of flexibility of different budgetary items, restrict and constrain the effective implementation of the triple nexus approach. I think we need to work on this. As a recommendation, one of our recommendations has to do with the flexibility of the budgetary items. We need to adapt perhaps some calls for projects to a new type of categorization, because the normal categories that we use when we're talking about aid, because we distinguish between humanitarian aid and development cooperation projects, perhaps we need to rethink that. We believe that we can divide up or use different sorts of categories. Maybe we could group them with regard to strategies and then other ones for training and transfer, knowledge transfer. So organize the calls in a different way. We can have a call aimed at strengthening local organizations. I think that would be very important if we want to improve everything that we do. So this would be a recommendation that we would make, along with a more flexible type of funding. Although we do understand that operationally, this is quite difficult, because we have to obey the law, and there's a series of procedures which have already been established. So to continue in this same category, our next conclusion is that calls for development and humanitarian action projects may promote coordination, collaboration, and the complementary nature of the activities of carried out by organizations that work on each element of the triple nexus through the presentation of projects as a kind of consortium, using a consortium approach. So it's important to have all three elements of the triple nexus to be included in this, which is why we believe that it's important to focus more on the complementary nature of the different activities. And if we had a sort of consortium-like figure, that would be a very interesting, perhaps, way forward. It would be, obviously, we would have more focus on one or the other of the elements, but all three elements would be included. And then calls for grants or calls for products should also foster collaboration with the beneficiary population and the formal and informal authorities. This is a very positive aspect to work on. because this is an important issue for eLankidetza, the collaboration with formal and informal authorities. And we believe that the idea of both formal and informal authorities, this is very important because that has to do with the different contexts and the different conflict scenarios. In a conflict scenario, it's really important to know where you're working. You need to analyze the different stakeholders, and then you need to identify the formal authorities, the informal authorities, to enable you to work more effectively. When we're talking about authorities, there are a lot of things that you can understand by this, and there are a lot of different examples and a lot of different factors that can be used to identify them. Sometimes we're talking about political authorities, sometimes we're talking about social authorities. Maybe they're authorities that have to do with the criminal world as well. So this is a very interesting area, and we need to focus more on this. To continue with the conclusions, but from the point of view more of humanitarian action projects and strategies analyzed, one conclusion is that the majority of humanitarian action strategies and projects have indeed incorporated this VARD approach. So our recommendation for that is, we need to foster the triple nexus approach in the call for grants. And we also need to include methodologies that are sensitive to conflict. So again, there are some recommendations that cover several conclusions. And the idea is to break away from this linear approach that Marta mentioned before, and to try to work in a simultaneous manner, looking at all three elements at the same time. Another conclusion that we have drawn is that most organizations coordinate with different stakeholders, such as local and national authorities, UN agencies, etc. And the idea would be to strengthen coordination. We know coordination exists, so let's strengthen it. And perhaps we can even foster the idea of projects which are presented as in consortium format, and they can include different elements. So it's not just a consortium that just work on humanitarian aid. No, we want to have consortium which include different approaches. So it can be a practical approach that will help us to implement the triple nexus. So another conclusion would be that the majority of humanitarian interventions carry out actions that promote more long-lasting solutions. So we believe that humanitarian actions have the potential to transform the conflict. And that's very interesting, because when we understand that conflict and violence are not necessarily synonyms, you can have, so I think there's a lot of potential there for the humanitarian organizations. And as a recommendation, the aim would be to incorporate elements that would guide the implementation of triple helix. So, for example, in Appendix 2, for example, we propose a battery of possible questions that could help when we are coming into contact, first of all, with a beneficiary organization. These questions have to do with the knowledge of the conflict scenario, the identification of stakeholders, questions that have to do with how to transform the conflict in a peaceful way, questions that have to do also with possible reconciliation processes. So now looking at development projects and direct aid, all of those that were analyzed, One conclusion would be that in the projects, we have identified coordination mechanisms for working with different stakeholders, and mainly different coordination mechanisms between development stakeholders and peace-building stakeholders. So our recommendation would be to reinforce this coordination and the complementary nature of the different actions carried out so that we can have a greater degree of coordination and a greater degree of connection between different stakeholders. The 13th conclusion, there aren't many left now, don't worry, has to do is the following. Is that the human rights approach has really played a key role in, I'm sorry, he is breaking up, so we're doing our best to understand what he's saying, has played a key role in the development projects that were analyzed, where what we're aiming to do is to protect the beneficiaries. I would like to just state here that the rights-based approach is quite difficult because we're talking about the state has to be involved because the state is responsible for protecting these rights. But we have certain agencies which can, in fact, have the capacity to enter into debates and conversations and negotiations with the state or the other entities which are responsible for guaranteeing the rights, then that is very important. And in fact, we should be coordinating with them more closely. And then in the development projects studied, most of them have carried out an analysis of the scenario and of the conflict. And this is very important as well, because we've seen that in many cases, the situation itself and the scenario is, in fact, analyzed to try to identify those elements that might help bring about peace and how this could be done, what new activities can be instigated, how can we modify existing activities. We also believe that this doesn't just mean we're working in conflict, we're working towards the conflict. So when you take into account possible problems between communities or land disputes, for example, the idea of modifying some processes in order to try to prevent certain acts of violence, etc., we believe that this can constitute an important element in peace building.
Something very interesting in most of the projects of education for social transformation is that they're aimed at raising awareness among the population. That's very interesting, taking into consideration that we're talking about education, educational projects that have been implemented in Basque Country, but we believe there's an interesting connection, especially with everything related to the perception of Basque population concerning what's going on in the places where projects are implemented. And I think that there's this element of transnationalism, so to say, or internationalism, better said. And for that, we would like to incorporate elements that would help implement the triple nexus and also, for instance, the incorporation of conflict-sensitive methodologies. As for education, we believe education is key, both education as an element to raise awareness where the agencies are, and also on-site. We believe this is an interesting element which helps us to transform the conflicts in the medium and long term. Finally, this is a very specific conclusion concerning a figure that we have at eLankidetza, which is direct aid that need to be applied for through a very specific document called concept note. This is a very short form, And we've seen that there's a recommendation we can make there. Why should not use this or existing form in this adaptation? Maybe adapt it to a new categorization of calls, but also, or maybe we could try to adapt it to strategies and maybe not to projects. There is an initiative which are the strategies that require less details, and some other initiatives that are projects and require less details. And therefore, we can use this concept note form, which is already there. It's already included in the strategies that we have, that you have at Lankidetza. Right, and finally, these are the recommendations. I've included all of them here, and they're related to the conclusions. Very briefly, let's have a look at them very briefly. We recommend to explicitly incorporate the triple nexus approach in the master plan. We're going to include it explicitly, not for it to become another section of it. And of course, each element will be considered with its main principles and objectives, always having in mind transformation, peaceful transformation of violence situations, this positive peace concept that's been mentioned earlier on. Second recommendation, strengthening the triple nexus approach in humanitarian action strategy. Here we can use cross-the-board approaches that are already there. We can also use the action axis that we already have. The third recommendation would be to adapt the calls for proposals to a new categorization. This recommendation, we know, is a recommendation that will be able to be implemented in the mid and long term. We believe it's important to have this vision, this long-term vision. You need calls for proposals based on development, humanitarian action, etc. And we believe that in the end, this approach divides something that should be united. And this is why we believe it would be interesting to think about some kind of call that would make a difference between strategies and projects, and that would incorporate all three elements. Another type of calls that would have to do with, or would be aimed at strengthening local organizations, and another call that would be aimed at training, education, knowledge exchange. And this would all help us to build this triple nexus that is still in construction. Fourth recommendation, to promote the coherence of the triple nexus approach in the calls for proposals. 5, to incorporate aspects that guide the implementation of the triple nexus. And here we need to include the questions in Appendix 2, because organizations need some kind of support, a guide. We need to take into consideration that there are elements that divide, some others that unite elements, and this has to do with the possible or the potential negative effects of a project. Maybe a project can have a negative impact on some kind of authority, formal or informal, that's not advisable. Then that's something to be taken into consideration. Sixth recommendations, strengthening coordination and complementarity. This is something we've already covered. This is key. And we need to look at all three elements. We need to have a commitment with a flexible and strategic system for funding. We know what red tape looks like, so we need to be very careful there and make things simpler and easier. We're fully aware of that. In the different interviews, we know that flexibility is required, and especially if this is justified in this different scenarios. And I think that different scenarios need to be taken into consideration, the different conflicts. And then the last recommendation here would be to incorporate conflict-sensitive methodologies. such as action without harm. This is, of course, not the only one. We believe we need to go beyond this. But why am I mentioning it? Because this is related to a very specific methodology, and we have analyzed deeply, and so we know quite well how to go about it. We've identified problem analysis, objectives, the strategy, etc., etc. So there's a lot of knowledge about that. But of course, the door is open to other methodologies that would incorporate maybe that peace element more intensely, which is something we need. We needed to be more and more involved in the process. And that's all for me. Thank you very much for your attention. I'll be happy to take your questions. Thank you.
Sí, muchísimas gracias, Lucía y Alfredo.
Thank you very much, Lucía and Alfredo, for this wonderful presentation.
Hay en el chat varias preguntas,
there are some questions in the chat, but they're not related to the research study. They're more general questions, so we'll leave them for later because we're running out of time. And I would like to ask you, Paco, Karlos, Marta, what would be your reaction to these conclusions and recommendations we have from our colleagues from IASC? What do you think about them? What are the main priorities there? What's your opinion? And maybe can we have some very quick reaction from you, and then we will move on to the questions that may be in the chat, right?
Bueno, me lanzo yo, que veo que Karlos y Marta están ahí más discretos. Bueno, enhorabuena por el estudio.
First of all, congratulations on this study. I had the opportunity to read it through very quickly.
Pero sí algunos comentarios. Hay una palabra que se repite mucho.
I have some comments, and the first one would be that there's a term that's recurrent here. Implicitly, many people in many projects share ideas related to the triple nexus. Your proposals are in line with making that more explicit, and I think that's very much in line with the official document concerning the triple nexus. But there's something that we haven't seen so recurrently and so strongly, maybe, which is the idea of common risk or collective outcomes. And that's something that's very complex. I mean, it's very hard for people working in humanitarian action, cooperation for development and peace building. It's very hard to put them all in, to bring them together, for them to come to a consensus, and that requires an early stage coordination. We have collective diagnosis, we can share them, of course, and then we can share diagnosis by the different stakeholders. But the main challenge would be for the Basque cooperation and for other cooperations in other contexts. We have these collective outcomes where we can have the contribution of different stakeholders. Another idea is moving from the implicit to explicit, having collective outcomes and being more demanding. So there we need indicators, etc., etc. And then there's a topic that's always very hard for concerning flexible funding. I think flexibility is a term that humanitarian agencies like very much, but donors don't like it so much, actually, because flexibility can mean some kind of anarchy concerning justification of expenses. In the document for development in 2019, it was stated that flexibility is required. I think we need to be more specific about that, and I think that's one of the main objectives of tomorrow's meeting. And Lankidetza should think about how we can adapt the process and what are the best practices in Basque cooperation in order to build new mechanisms for funding that may be more aligned to this triple nexus concept. And I will stop here, but I would say that this report is really interesting, and I think that we will need to be more specific when we've had the chance to read it in detail and think about it. Well, thank you very much, Paco. Carlos, Marta.
Bueno, pues sí, enhorabuena, Alfredo.
Yes, congratulations, Alfredo and Lucia, for this wonderful study. There are plenty of ideas. This is a very interesting piece of research. I got it yesterday, and I've read it through very quickly, so my comments, of course, are not very deep. There's one thing that I've seen at different moments, which is the potential of Basque cooperation when it comes to implementing triple nexus. There are some experiences in all three pillars: humanitarian action, cooperation for development, and peace building. Like, for instance, transitional justice, protection of people, defending human rights, gender-based justice, memory, etc., etc. So there is a huge potential there. And of course, here I would include human rights, which is tackled in point number 13 in this study. So we do have that experience, but then there's another idea that is recurrent in the document, which is that potential is not made the most of. So there is still margin to improve it, to make what's implicit explicit, to improve coordination in the analysis of conflicts, local analysis, as Alfredo said. This is something fundamental. This is a good starting point. We need good analysis on site. And one of the key elements in order to make headway towards the implementation of triple nexus in Basque cooperation is related to something you've mentioned, which is having a conflict-sensitive approach. And I inevitably read this thinking about a report that we issued in Hegoa in 2018. I've included the link in the chat. It's called Study and Diagnosis of Approaches that are Sensitive to Conflict in Basque Cooperation. In that case, we interviewed many NGOs in the Basque Country, also provincial governments, the agency, some city councils as well. And the idea there was to know to what extent where these conflict-sensitive approaches applied at that time. So you've got the link of this study. You can have a look at it, and I will tell you very briefly that we concluded that there was a vague idea of what being sensitive to a conflict meant in the different stakeholders. And, for instance, there was a lack of knowledge about the different approaches, the peace and conflict impact assessment and different tools that have been developed over the past decades. We also concluded lack of training, lack of well-trained people. And we also lacked people working in gender-based conflicts, etc. That has improved very much over the past years, but this is something we concluded back then. There was also a lack of tools, documents, training spaces, etc. And I'm saying all this because if we want to move forward in the triple nexus concept or approach, we need to train the different stakeholders in Basque cooperation, and that needs to go hand in hand with changes in standards. For instance, if we modify calls and we have new criteria included related to the implementation of this approach, we may be taking a huge leap if we don't have well-trained people in NGOs that can, for instance, carry out analysis or maybe designing projects that include this element in their approaches. So that's something we need to work on. Training spaces. We need also documents, guidelines, etc. And then, to conclude, I would say that as I was reading the report, especially the parts concerning education, and there's this quote by Jenny Pierce, you may be familiar with. She's a British person, a specialist in conflicts, and she said something that I would like to quote here. She said, the opposite of peace building, the opposite of peace is not conflict, it's violences in the plural form. And I think this is a very simple quote. This lays the foundations of a reconceptualization of many of the things we do that are considered to be related to peace building. So we don't need to think so much about how to face armed conflicts, but rather about how to face different forms of violence. This is why violence is in the plural form in her quote. And this can happen in armed conflicts, but in other conflicts, it could be gender-based violence or urban violence. There are many ways of being violent. So when we speak about this, we need to have this new, larger or broader approach, and we need to be sensitive to the different forms of violence. Going back to this positive peace concept that I mentioned earlier on, positive peace means that we have to face three types of violence, not just physical direct violence, but also structural violence and cultural violence. So this is also related to education, specifically to education for peace. So in our projects, we need to incorporate not just elements concerning training and training objectives, but also one type of education that moves towards peace building, that moves towards overcoming all these cultural violence that enables violence to be exerted directly or not on specific individuals or groups of individuals, different language forms, different stigmatization elements concerning different groups of people. I think this should be an important part of the work we can carry out from decentralized cooperation for peace building. Thank you.
Thank you, Carlos.
Marta, I don't know if you want to make any comment very briefly, because we don't have much time left. This presentation has been very interesting. I haven't had the chance to read the summary of your study. I think this piece of research is very detailed. I really like that. You have incorporated many of the elements we were discussing before the presentation. So it's been very interesting listening to you. I think there are three elements in all 8 recommendations you've made. Very strong ones, like for instance, collaboration, flexibility, not just financial flexibility, but also flexibility concerning the different proposals. And then there's accountability accountability, shared accountability among the different stakeholders. And I would like to make some comments about that. Concerning collaboration, your recommendation is interesting about calls that cover everything so that we foster consortiums or partnerships that cover for everything. Of course, we need to know about other initiatives so that different organizations that don't necessarily have experience about all the issues can make an important contribution. So I'm not talking about conflict-sensitive, the conflict-sensitive ingredient. That's something should be integrated in many contexts and organizations. But I do think it's important to open up this perspective and to collaborating with other stakeholders that may already be working very well, so that we don't do things twice. Concerning flexibility, I very much agree with the fact that funding should be flexible, but on top of that, it should be multi-annual. It should cover for different years. That's something that we've observed. It's really important. And finally, I would like to add that your fifth recommendation is very interesting. It's about elements that can guide the implementation of the triple nexus approach. And you talk about gender-based nexus. You don't speak about the roles of women. And I think that concerning Basque cooperation, that's really key, because women's associations and associations led by women in this context play a major key role. And I will conclude by saying that the triple nexus is theoretical, but there's already a lot of material there available. So I would recommend you not to develop many different tools, but rather focus on using what we already have and maybe move on to action and to thinking what we can do in the practice. Marta, thank you very much. That's a huge challenge. I believe there are questions in the chat about practical experiences. We have a few minutes to answer the questions we have in the chat. Alicia?
Pilar,
Yes.
si quieres te hago un resumen de unas de las preguntas que nos han hecho. Tampoco tenemos mucho tiempo. Solo un anuncio. Las personas de Congo han perdido conexión y quieren las grabaciones de esta sesión. Lo mismo que documentos en francés para poder acceder a los contenidos. Y vamos a las preguntas. Pascal Lufungula nos pregunta ¿cómo reducir la violencia en conflictos armados sostenidos por multinacionales? Segunda pregunta de Angie Jiménez. Nos pregunta sobre los desafíos de la operativización, un poco que ya está contestado, pero sobre todo, ¿cómo medir el éxito de la integración de estos enfoques? Tercera pregunta, Gebrelasi Kidanu, de Forward Beam, de Tigray, Etiopía, nos pregunta si el enfoque del triple nexo es un enfoque de arriba abajo, ¿cómo responde a las necesidades de las personas necesitadas? Una pregunta más filosófica. Carmele, de aquí de Euskadi, nos ha preguntado enfoques, pero de alguna manera ya se ha contestado. Y finalmente otra pregunta sobre de la República Democrática del Congo. Nos preguntan si conocen de financiadores, agencias financiadoras que ya están aplicando el enfoque de triple nexo. Y creo que este es un resumen de las preguntas más importantes que están en el chat.
Thank you, Alicia. Muy amplias y de distinto tipo, pero no sé, a ver, Karlos,
they have different nature, so I don't know. Paco, Marta, Karlos, Alfredo, Lucía. Do you want to answer any of them? I would like to answer two of them. Question from the Democratic Republic of Congo. There's a group of donors. Donors in DRC are coordinated, and in fact, if I'm not mistaken, I believe it's the Swiss cooperation that is leading the discussion about the implementation of a triple nexus approach. In fact, they've been working in DRCs. They've been working there for 6-7 years now, trying to design strategies, and so they've made headway there. For our colleagues in Ethiopia, how to make this bottom-up approach? Well, we've seen when implementing a triple nexus approach, regional coordination, regional meaning local, are more successful, far more successful than the national scale, which is just a declaration of intentions. And from that perspective, from the regional perspective, with regional stakeholders and placing population center stage, I think that the outcomes are much better and the strategies are much more successful. Thank you. I can answer some questions very briefly. The triple nexus approach needs to prove that it's effective in the field, and for that we need assessments. And there are some initiatives to establish some indicators and monitoring and assessment systems that are fair for all three components of the triple nexus approach and to the addition of all three pillars, so that the triple nexus is not just the addition of three elements. And then there are some contexts, as Marta was saying, where some donors are in connection. We are now analyzing the case of Colombia, but many donors are trying to fund triple nexus approach related projects, and so the triple nexus is now being used as one more criterion. So I think things are moving and changing and proving that the triple nexus is an added value versus isolated projects. There's something that we've found in some missions, which is the lack of relationship between local stakeholders in each one of the pillars. And back in Colombia, there's a group of NGOs there, humanitarian NGOs, that are not in touch with peace-building initiatives in the country and with some stakeholders concerning development. So we need to foster coordination among stakeholders at a local level. And, because that's something that could help us very much. Thank you very much, Paco. Well, I would like to answer one of these questions about how we can build peace or face violence in contexts where there's a conflict supported by multinational corporations. I think that question comes from Congo. Well, there are some fields of action that, of course, go beyond the triple nexus framework or scope. So what can we do? Our NGOs working on cooperation of development of peace building. Well, we can have a political influence. I mean, that's not something we can implement in the countries that are suffering this violence, but rather in northern countries, which are the ones that have normally originated or created these multinational corporations. There are many experiences in that concern concerning with regards to diamond exploitation, oil companies as well. Some companies publish what they pay and demand transparency. There's a demand to oil corporations so that they publish their accounts and what they pay to specific countries to import oil. In Angola, for instance, where I've been working, there was quite a lot of money paid, not to the state, but to the elites. And that, for instance, was feeding the armed conflicts. So transparency is required, and that's a different way of, or a different field of action, which is not exactly the triple nexus, but is quite related to it, and it's important as well.
Sí, había antes la palabra pedida, ya no veo que es así. No sé,
someone had asked for the floor before.
Pilar, hay una última pregunta de Carmele del Comité Español de la CNUR.
By Carmele from the Spanish Committee.
Ejemplos concretos de actuaciones en las que se aplique el triple nexo en contextos de conflictos armados y de países de acogida con conflictos latentes de larga duración.
And host countries with latent, long-lasting conflicts. I don't know if we have time to answer that now, but perhaps tomorrow we're going to see more specific examples. I've put on the chat a compilation of best practices in which there are 16 case studies as Colombia, but there are other countries as well. I can't remember them off the top of my head, but what I mean is that today I haven't seen an experience which does apply the nexus for a long time, over a long period of time, in all its different dimensions. There are some experiences in Cameroon, for example, which are very interesting. There are some experiences, or one experience at least in Afghanistan, before the latest political developments. There are a number of different experiences that have been documented, I believe, can help. But having said that, I think we're still trying to put all the pieces of the puzzle together to get the right outcome. If you will just let me very rapidly say that there is a lot of experiences with regard to conflict stabilization, but experiences that you can actually call triple nexus experiences, they're very few and far between. For example, we have the organization where Emily Anderson works as well, is doing quite a lot of work in this sense. Excuse me. With regard to measuring, indicators are a very important issue. We haven't talked about that yet, but when we're measuring the success of the different initiatives, we need to look at the indicators that we use. Not just the traditional indicators or smart indicators, but other types of indicators as well. Because indicators tell us whether or not we have actually complied and achieved our aims. So that's important as well to take into account. I think that in the publication that Marta was talking about with the 16 examples, it's really interesting. They look at it from a more macro perspective, and the whole country, or at least a whole region. Now, I have a lot of problems there. There are a lot of problems there with regard to manipulation of the aid provided. Someone in the chat, I think, has posted an experience in which we have collaborated in Colombia called Mide Plus. And we have the early recovery mechanism there, and they have used that to apply the triple nexus, but not at a macro level, at a much more micro, local level, and successfully, in fact. So I think we need to distinguish between these two different levels. They have the macro level where you have the multilateralist organizations and they're involving military forces, and then micro level, where I think that the experiences are much more optimistic.
Muchísimas gracias, Paco, Alfredo.
Thank you very much, Paco, Alfredo, Marta, Karlos, and Lucía for that sharing with us, giving us the benefit of your expertise. Just to sum up very, very quickly, I would say that the triple nexus approach is pertinent, it's necessary, in fact, because we're working in contexts that are increasingly complex and we have fewer and fewer resources. So we need to work in a coordinated fashion simultaneously, and it's true that we need to clarify what peace actually means, whether it has a capital P or a small p. And perhaps in the piece with a small p is where local organizations are working perhaps more successfully. And as a decentralized organization, we have a wonderful opportunity because we have fewer geopolitical pressure, so we can actually work at a much more effective way at a smaller scale rather than at the macro scale. And we need to renovate all our actions. So thank you very much for the study, for the recommendations that you've come up with. We'll study them in depth and we'll see how we can incorporate them, working in collaboration with our partner agencies and organizations so that we can continue to incorporate the triple nexus approach in the initiatives that we are funding in a flexible way, in a sustainable, continued way. There seems to be a lot of potential there, so we'll do our very best to make the most of it. Thank you all very much for participating. Thank you very much for your contributions. And we'll see you tomorrow morning. Thank you very much. Good evening.
Alfredo.